I pretty much went to law school knowing I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. When I came out of law school in 1965, I went to a civil rights firm in New York, but I really wanted to go to the Deep South, so I ended up going and working with migrant workers in South Florida. I had spent a summer vacation in Mississippi as a volunteer with the Lawyers Constitutional LCDC in 1966, and I think from the vantage point at that point in history, it seemed like Mississippi was the most intense civil rights lawyering experience you could have. Part of that's just media, because I'm sure there are parts of Louisiana and South Carolina were just as rough, but it was rough. I've just completed an anthology of civil rights lawyers from that era, and I think the readers will be surprised how many lawyers got arrested, beat up, had shotguns shoved in their mouth, this kind of stuff. So I digress. But so when I was working with migrant workers, I came here to Mississippi. I knew Mike Chister, who was the director. For some reason, about the time I got here, he made me the deputy director. I think that position in today's legal service would be more like director of litigation. We really didn't spend a lot of time on administration. We hired lawyers and we established new offices, but spent most of our time doing complex federal litigation. And for me, the majority of that was doing desegregation suits. I think somebody last night talked about that everything north of Federal 82 was the deseg suits were all legal services, which is pretty much true. I think there were 18 school systems under order when I left in early 1970. And that was, of course, the period, that was the real tipping point nationally in terms of the Supreme Court's opinions. It was thrilling being here. I was not married at the time. Basically, there was nobody for me to date because the legal services lawyers were considered bad guys by the vast majority of Mississippians who were white. Black folks liked us just fine. So I ended up leaving here and going to Los Angeles to become the director of legal services in Los Angeles. Only job I ever hated, and I came back to North Florida, which had no civil rights lawyers, and set up my own firm in 1971, which exists to this day, although I'm mostly retired. So that's a synopsis.
So you were here
I came here in late 68, all of 69, and the first part of 1970. Wow. And during that time, one of the things in terms of the history of the program, that's the period in which we went from 2 offices to 5. We established Batesville, West Point, and the Greenwood office. Of course, Greenwood office had Alex Sanders, who later ascended to be the director of the whole program.
Right.
The West Point office had Jesse Pennington and Tommy Mayfield. I think in the Batesville office, it was Bob Kelly and Joyner, who was a Ole Miss grad. They were both Ole Miss grads. And that was the expansion at that time.
You remember, you heard a lot of stories last night and today, but do you remember any other great stories that you'd like to
Lord.
About?
How many hours ago? I mean, seriously. Let me tell a story about Oxford that I alluded to last night.
Could you describe Oxford back then? I know it's...
Oh, yeah. Coming here, I've been here once since I left. I came in about 97 or something. And that Oxford looked not too different from the Oxford of 68, 69. Today, I hardly recognize the place. The gentrification is really quite extraordinary. I kind of like the old Oxford, actually, but That's just that. We couldn't even figure out for sure. Mike and I went downtown and we tried to figure out which building was where our office was, because we were on the square.
I remember.
And we think we know what it is. They've changed the numbers. We were
You were
108 and a half. We were upstairs. And upstairs, you went up the stairs, and left, you went to legal service, and right, you went to the Rebel School of Cosmetology. And I have a picture of because they had inscribed their name on the face of the building on the second story. I've got a picture of the Rebel School of Cosmetology. Yeah, I do, yeah.
Shoot it to me sometime.
Oh, okay. Well, you write me a thing. I'll do that. Yeah, so it's a radically different Oxford from what I knew. The story about desegregating the schools, and it's a story about Judge Katie too. A story about the parents. When we brought the school desegregation case against Oxford Municipal Separate School District, the school board's response was they wanted to close down the historic black high school and put all the kids, black and white, in double sessions. And of course, anybody said, well, double sessions, that's a pretty bad educational choice. But of course, school board didn't care about education as much as they did about race. And so when they filed their plan, what would happen is the judge would ask for a plan from the school board. They filed their plan, and the parents, and we talked about this a lot, and the parents were really concerned about shutting down the school. It's very understandable. And John Britton and I represented the parents. We went to Greenville with a hearing before Judge Katie, and we said, we brought witnesses who talked about the importance of, above and beyond having just a school, that a school building is an institution in the community. There's a lot of pride, there's a lot of history, and what the white board was doing was basically trying to erase all that. So the school board, when we inquired as why the school board wanted to shut the black high school down, they said, oh, because it's dangerous, because there's a railroad track there and the trains go by. Now, it does raise the question, why was it okay for 50 years for the black children to be in this really dangerous environment? But we knew that was all poppycock, so we called this really elderly man to the stand during a hearing. It was so funny. Called this guy to the stand and said, where do you live? I live right next to the railroad. I said, I don't know. So, are you familiar with the railroad schedule? Yeah, I am. Has it changed in the last 40 years? No. So, yeah, how many trains a day? One. What times it come? 4 a.m. in the morning. And the judge even thought that was pretty funny. And what the judge did was really, in terms of what was going on in terms of desegregation in the whole South, what he did was pretty advanced. He said, you can't close the black school. You have to, whatever your plan is, you have to include that campus and that building. And as you know, right this minute, I just drove by it yesterday. They've added on to it, I think, a lot. But what we saw as soon as Judge Katie did that, not surprisingly, they just poured money into it that summer before the children all were to report back in the fall of 1969. So it was a great victory for the parents, and Judge Katie really showed himself, this was Katie at his very best, and it was very good. So, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what aspect of your work you're the most proud of?
I don't know. I've loved being a civil rights lawyer. I've been a little civil rights lawyer for, I guess, 50 years now.
Wow.
Well, I was graduated law school in 65, so it's 16. One thing that was special that people didn't talk about much when we were here, I was typical in the sense that the sort of vanguard of most of the civil rights lawyering in, say, 1965 to 1970 was mostly Yankees who came to Mississippi. And, I think it's a good thing we did. And it was I don't have any regrets about that. But what was really heartening to me is that I was here in the time, it was the first generation of born and bred white Mississippians who were willing to identify themselves with the Civil Rights Movement. John Maxey came out in 1968 and sued the Holly Springs School District. I mean, and he records his conversations. You should get him on this oral history here. One of the superintendents said it was the worst thing since Ulysses S. Grant that he had sued the school district. But and then coming out of the class of '69, we have Tom Royals, Tommy Mayfield, and it was a new generation, a new Mississippi, that there were young white lawyers. And the other thing, of course, is happening is that this is the first generation of black lawyers who even came out of the law school. So you had people like Connie Slaughter and Nasir Stewart, Macklemore. So, but I was very heartened that it was. I mean, the people like Tom and Tommy, Mayfield and Royals, they never turned back. I mean, they consistently, their attitudes about race were, radically different than those of their parents and the communities from which they came. Those two guys came out of Smith County, which is sort of another story in itself.
Makes me want to know more about what they've done throughout their life.
Well, Royals and Mayfield had a private firm. They did a lot of criminal defense. Tommy spent part of his career as a prosecutor, a very good prosecutor. Still doing part-time prosecuting right now in Canton. But the law firm was in Jackson. So they've remained true. Maxey, I think his firm did mostly personal injury, but some civil rights, did some labor work. They represented unions. So again, I think the general political direction of those people reflected as they came out of law school, that they remained true to that. Well, the other thing too, and I think this is I think Mike thought this up. My memory is every semester we had 18 law clerks. Now, we didn't really need that many, but there was a bigger plan. The bigger plan was to expose as many Ole Miss law students to what is it to, really let them see what poverty is, let them see racism up closer than they had ever seen it. A moving story about Connie Slaughter and Nasir Stewart, who were clerks for me. And I didn't see this coming. One day I sent them off to Marks, Mississippi to interview somebody, or I don't even remember the assignment. They're both from the Hill Country. Nasir's from Starkville and Connie's from Brandon. And when they came back to my office, they broke down crying. I didn't see that. And what they reported was they'd seen poverty. I sent them to Marks, Mississippi, and every single black street in Marks, Mississippi was mud. And I mean, it just struck them. They're both very compassionate people, and they'd never seen anything like that, even though they were lifelong Mississippians. And I had never, I knew about Hill Country and Delta, but I didn't really attribute the kind of significance to it that they did as native Mississippians. I thought that was really interesting.
I remember, I'm older myself. I remember when Robert Kennedy came to Marks and, to.
Oh, before the '68 march? Yeah.
He was in Marks, Mississippi, I think, to demonstrate the poverty.
Right.
And I can't remember
Well, I think the context, I don't specifically remember Robert Kennedy's visit, but Dr. King chose Marx as the starting point from the caravan that went all the way to Washington, D.C., which, of course, by the time it got there, he had been assassinated. But Dr. King chose Marx, and it wasn't an accidental choice. A very, very thoughtful choice.
In reality, if it hadn't been for people like you and the people who spoke today, what do you think would have happened here?
It's hard to know. I mean, I think, it's a very organic process. There were people like me who grew up in the North, but just realized that the most intense social justice thing going on in the late 60s, well, and earlier, was what was happening in the Deep South in terms of racism and pushing back. In the anthology, it's getting published by the University Press of Florida. I have 10 essays, 5 from the South and 5 from the North, of how did you become a civil rights lawyer? How in heaven's sakes? I mean, and you think about the Southern kids, these are all the 5 Southerners, at least the white ones, grew up in an incredibly racist environment. Lachlan McDonald from South Carolina talks about growing up in his environment and just the classic privileged upper middle class white background you'd expect from that era. Now, Fred Gray was black, so it's a little different evolution for Fred, but I thought it was a really interesting inquiry about where did these civil rights lawyers come from, and 5 of them are Yankees. So the Yankees had to make a choice to come to the Deep South. No Southern state had as big an influx of outside civil rights lawyers as Mississippi, by a substantial margin. Because what happened in Jackson, you had the Lawyers Constitutional Right, LCDC, that was created by the American Civil Liberties Union, and they had an office on North Fair Street. The Legal Defense Fund had an office on Fair Street that was staffed by Marion Wright, now Marion Wright Edelman, and Henry Aronson, and later Fred Banks.
About what time period was this?
Marion and Henry Aronson came in 1964 and stayed till about 1967. There was a married couple, Paul and Iris Brest were in that office in about the 66 or so era. Mel Leventhal came when he was graduated at NYU, came to about 67. Then Fred Banks came in 68.
Okay, well.
How we do?
I'm now recording.
Yeah, we're talking about where Mississippi was in terms of its comparison compared to other states in the Deep South. And what was different was you ended up, then the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, started by John F. Kennedy hauling in the ABA lawyers in the summer of 1963. So you had 3 very active nonprofits that lasted for, each had a different lifespan, but say a decade each. Well, there's no Southern state that hadn't, I don't know, certainly not 3, and actually probably not 1. LCDC had an office in New Orleans, but LDF did not have an office anywhere else. The Lawyers Committee did not have an office anywhere else.
LDF is
Lawyers, Defense Fund. So, Mississippi may have been the worst state, but it had more resources than any other state by far. And this was all an influx of Yankees until, and then legal services. I mean, when I was here, we were a de facto civil rights law firm. I mean, that all I did was civil rights. You know, like I said, when I left, we had 18 school districts under order. And, you know, so that was another nonprofit. That's 4 nonprofits. And I don't know if there are other legal services programs who are doing DSEG other parts of the South or not. I'm not sure about that. So, I was going to tell a couple of Judge Smith stories, because Judge Orma Smith is clearly in the Hall of Fame of not just judges in the Deep South. I would take Orma Smith against a national array of judges. He was just that good and that principled. A couple of Judge Smith stories. One time, we had one of the DSEG cases. The superintendent was on the stand, and he would say "nigra" in a way was right on the edge, and the blacks in the audience would there would be this murmur, because of course blacks are on one side and whites are on the other, not by law, but by the blacks. I think in that era really liked the idea of being together on one side of the courtroom. Other places they were actually pushed there, but in our DSEG cases it was, I think, by choice. Well, yeah, so they would murmur, and Judge Smith just kind of looked up and I said, Your Honor, I think I know what's disquieting, Your Honor. I think the little murmurs in the court are because the superintendent saying the word Negro, but he pronounces it in such a way that it's perilously close to a racial epithet. He said, Good point, Mr. Spriggs. Mr. Superintendent, when you refer to the Negro race, would you just say black from now on? Well, for a white Mississippian to say the word black as a racial ascription in 1969 was anathema. I mean, it was like the rest of his testimony, he could almost not speak. He'd come to the word and black. He just, because it was so associated with a very progressive, radical point of view of black thinking. And that was Judge Smith. He didn't even think about it. He just said, "Oh, that's a good idea. Let's not." I didn't even suggest it. He thought it out. So that's Judge Smith. Here's another thing. It's not a long story about Judge Smith, but when we desegregated the schools in Aberdeen, the school board, in their infinite wisdom, informed the court that they were going to close the black high school, and they're going to take all those trophies. This black high school had won all kind of state trophies, and they had this giant trophy case. They're going to take all the trophies and put them in a closet or something. In fact, they didn't even tell the court. I think the parents came to us and said, "Hey, they took all the trophies from the black school and they put them in the closet." And we went to Judge Smith. He says, "No." He says, "No. You're going to take the trophies out?" And the white school had a few little trophies. The black school had all these trophies. And you're going to put them all on an equal basis in the display counter. That was Judge Smith. I mean, he's a great man. He actually did another thing that was very avant-garde. There's a guy named, you can't make this up, this is literati stuff. Pink Shaw was his name, from Hickory Flat, which you know up in, I think, Benton County, right? Pink Shaw is about 5'5", maybe 5'4", very soft-spoken. He came down to legal service and he said, "Attorney Spriggs, I can't get a loan from one of the Department of Agriculture agencies, I can't remember which, used to make loans to farmers." He was a small farmer. And what they would do is he had his application in, and they would just pass him by and give out the applications, fund the applications for competing whites. So we carried a case, and Judge Smith had this case. And the general understanding was, and this is pretty amazing when I think about it, and I don't know what happened after this, but the general thinking, if you'd have talked to constitutional lawyers and lawyers who are knowledgeable about federal grantee programs, they would have said, "Oh, well, with a loan application, there's so much discretion, and it has to do. It's not prohibiting a bad deed. It's like ordering it affirmatively, and there's all these arguments that you couldn't legally contest the failure to provide loans on an equal basis. And Judge Smith we won summary judgment. Judge Smith cut through that like hot knife through butter, and Pink got his loan, and yet we won in a summary judgment, and a lot of people said it wasn't even a cause of action, which was kind of interesting. It speaks well for Judge Smith. And then Pink wanted to pay us. I kept telling Pink, "You can't pay us, buddy." He said, and so finally, a week goes by or so much, and Pink comes to the office, and he's got a bag of strawberries. I mean, I don't know. There was enough, so we parceled out to everybody in the office. Every single person in the office took home a whole stash of strawberries. The only bad thing was they were pretty ripe, and they started getting a little wet, and I had a paper bag, and it kind of went through the paper bag. But it was so sweet of him. He was appreciative, and I told him we couldn't take fees, but we did take strawberries.
And Orma Smith, just for the record, was a federal judge.
Yes, ma'am.
And he was from Corinth. I don't think you mentioned.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. He was from Corinth, and this was Judge Clayton had been the only judge in the entire Northern District of Mississippi, and this was when Judge Cady and Judge Smith came on the bench. That was the time it was the first time they allotted 2 judgeships to the Northern District of Mississippi.
Was he appointed by Lyndon Johnson?
Oh golly. Yeah, I think so. I can't swear to it. Yeah, it makes sense that both he and Cady would have been Johnson appointees because Judge Clayton had been the only judge, and Judge Clayton, who was a former general, actually, I think.
There's a last question here. What difficulties did you encounter as a legal services lawyer is one, and then how does the modern civil rights movement compare to that of the 60s? If you're interested.
They're pretty giant questions. Difficulties. Well, we had 2 lawyers got arrested one day. I mean, Robert Kelly and John Timms got arrested down in Grenada by a very excitable young man, Judge Perry, who became a legend. Armand Durfner, a very prominent civil rights lawyer, I think said he was crazy. He was well known to be extraordinarily racist, and he, I can't remember exactly how we freed up Timms and Kelly, but so he got arrested. John Britton got charged with, he'll tell a story about getting charged. He did this morning, as a matter of fact. So you already got that one on tape, right? Yeah, so there was that kind of thing. David Lippman, a little bit later than I was in the program, David Lippman was monitoring elections in LaFleur County, and at the end of the day, he was the only one around, I think it was 1971, 72, something like that, in the polling place, and he went outside the courthouse, and this white little mini mob, maybe 6, 7, 8, jumped him and shoved a shotgun in his mouth, and then let him go. But I mean, that's something you remember the rest of your life. I had been arrested in Neshoba County, but that was back in 1966. Worked as a volunteer for the LCDC. So I don't know. I think there was some cultural isolation. Certainly, it's hard to find anybody to date. But no, but everybody in legal services, everybody in the program really believed in what we were doing. I mean, I would say a lot of people in the program weren't really doing what I would call civil rights, but we always, an inordinate percentage of our cases were with black clients. And so we were associated correctly with the black community. And everybody really had the fire in the belly. So it was good. It was good. How's it different today? Oh, God. Well, it's radically different. I mean, we were in a much more overtly racist society. We were integrating schools, and there was a national consensus that led to the 1964 and 1965 voting rights, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. There was a national consensus that the contradiction of race in the South was just too much, so that they actually beat the Southern filibuster. I mean, they had enough. What happened is Tennessee and Texas peeled off. At Yarborough, Mr. Gore Sr., Senator Gore Sr., so that they no longer could filibuster. And President Johnson, in a way that I don't think Kennedy could have pushed through the way Johnson did. He was outrageous in a good way, and he pulled it off. So yeah, I mean, confronting that kind of polarized situation is different today. There's nothing to desegregate. There's still employment discrimination. I have a class action in South Carolina right now, and it's a pretty racist place, but it's real different. I think one of the things that wasn't even on the horizon, a couple of things that were not on the horizon in the late 60s. The rich-poor divide, regardless of race. We all know the numbers. I mean, it's much more extreme today than it was in the late 60s. And anytime you have something that's a macroeconomic trend, you know black people are going to get smacked harder. I mean, that's always been true. I mean, the black unemployment rate has always been multiples of the white unemployment throughout the country, north, south, east, west. So the rich-poor divide has exacerbated the life situation of the collectivity of black people. But it's not accessible to a lawsuit. You can't bring us, pretty much. I mean, you can bring an employment discrimination case, and that's what I spent most of my career doing. And I think the other thing that's brilliantly discussed by Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow is that mass incarceration, that was not, if you look at the numbers, the percentage of the raw numbers of prisoners, the percentage of the population in prison from the late 60s, and then it starts pretty much with Nixon's war on drugs, gets exacerbated by President Reagan's war on drugs, is coddled by President Clinton's. President Clinton had some policies that really had some terrible impact on blacks. It's really ironic how people casually say, "Oh, he's the first black president," and all this kind of. Forget it, not so much, you know. And so that's had a very profound effect on the entire structure of black society in the United States, and it's pretty much, it's national. It's not a Southern thing. I mean, it's a national thing. And Michelle Alexander's book, which is arguably the best book on race in the 21st century in the United States, it is just a brilliant thesis. I don't know if you read it, but when it first came out, I saw the reviews. I said, "Oh, it's about racism in the justice industry. I know about that. Blah, blah, blah. 2 years later, I read it. I said, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't read this when it came out. She has so many layers, so many more layers than I had realized. I knew this piece and this piece and this piece. She weaves the whole thing together as a tapestry. And the reason, her hypothesis is that there are 3 eras of blacks in this country: slavery, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow, which is mass incarceration. But her thesis is so well defended and articulated that you come away, you can't doubt it. And we're just nibbling. I mean, there's now a slight pushback on decriminalization and stuff like that. But, I mean, it got this bad and we've nibbled back this much. So my hands are moving. But no, I think, we haven't made great gains on that. And I don't see, there's some talk in this political season about the rich-poor divide, but I don't see, especially with this Congress, I don't see holding rich people responsible for their share of the burden. I don't see it happening. And so many programs, social programs, have been eroded, so that has a really disparate impact on poor people, ipso facto, double impact on black people. So, no.
Anything else you would like to add? If not,
No, it's nice to come back and see old friends. And,
thank you for your submission.
oh, well, it's fun to do. I love to talk about these kind of things. Doing the anthology really has been good in the sense that it's just, I would think about these things anyhow, but doing the anthology, I mean, one of the things that came from peer review was somebody suggested, well, you should have a conclusion. I've got 72 articles in it, and it's all arranged thematically. But
And this is the one that you still...
Yes, ma'am. The manuscript is the contract's with the United Press of Florida,